Have you ever wondered why we feel so lost in a world filled with everything we thought we ever wanted? We chase after success. We hunger for love. We long for approval. And yet, in the quiet of the night, when the lights go out and the world stops watching, there's an emptiness, a silence that gnaws at the edges of our heart. And in that stillness, a subtle question arises. Who am I when no one's watching? It's strange, isn't it? We spend our entire lives mastering the art of looking outward. We dress to impress. We speak to be heard. We buy things we don't need to impress people we don't even like. We scroll endlessly through screens, searching for meaning in the fragments of other people's lives. But when was the last time you paused? Not to check your phone, not to plan your next move, but to simply be with yourself. For most of us, the answer is never, and it's not your fault. The world was designed this way. From the moment we were born, we were taught to seek everything outside of ourselves. Good grades, a better job, a bigger house, a perfect partner, endless likes and followers. And in that endless chase, we forgot the most ancient, sacred, and transformative journey any human can take. The journey inward. You see, long before modern life, long before empires rose and fell, the wise knew a truth we've almost entirely lost. That wisdom, true wisdom, doesn't come from books. It doesn't come from titles or money or power. It doesn't come from what others say about you. It comes from one place and one place only, yourself. Not the version of yourself you perform for the world, not the image you carefully curate on social media, but the raw, unfiltered, aching, beautiful truth of who you are when you stop pretending. The Buddha, over 2,500 years ago, wasn't a man seeking to conquer the world. He wasn't after riches or status. He walked away from palaces and pleasures not because they were evil, but because he saw them for what they were, distractions, mirages on the road to nowhere. He turned inward, sat beneath a tree, faced his fears, his desires, his illusions. And in the silence of his own heart, he woke up. That's why every great spiritual tradition, every mystic, every sage across time whispers the same timeless secret: know thyself, because everything else is noise. Yet here we are, centuries later, more connected than ever before, and somehow lonelier than we've ever been. Our minds cluttered with the opinions of strangers, our hearts pulled in 1,000 directions, our souls starving for something real. We tell ourselves stories. I'll be happy when I get that job. I'll finally feel whole when I fall in love. I'll be at peace when I have enough money. But every time we reach those milestones, there's a fleeting rush, a spark of joy, and then it fades. And we move the goalpost and chase again. It's an endless cycle, and deep down you felt it, that quiet voice. The one you drown out with noise, with busyness, with distractions. It keeps asking, is this all there is? The truth, no, it is. There's so much more, but you won't find it out there. Not in the next relationship, or the next purchase, or the next vacation. You won't find it in how many people know your name, or how many digits are in your bank account. You'll find it in the one place you've been avoiding your entire life, within. And yes, it's terrifying, because looking inward means facing parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. The regrets you buried, the fears you hide, the masks you wear. The aching questions about your purpose, your worth, your very existence. But here's the paradox. It's only by turning inward that we can ever be truly free. Because when you understand yourself, not the self the world told you to be, but your real, unguarded self, you begin to see life differently. You stop chasing, you start being. And in that space, wisdom is born. Not the kind of wisdom that fills bookshelves or wins debates, but the quiet, steady kind that holds you steady when storms come. That makes you see through illusions. That teaches you what matters and what doesn't. And when you start to live from that place, everything changes. The world may stay noisy, chaotic, demanding, but you won't be owned by it anymore. You'll realize you were never meant to be a prisoner of other people's opinions, never meant to drown in endless distractions, never meant to trade your soul for approval. You were meant to wake up, to turn inward, to come home. And as we journey deeper into this, you'll see the greatest battles we fight aren't out there. They're inside us, but so are our greatest victories, and it all begins the moment you dare to look within. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing everything you've been chasing, everything you've believed, everything you thought mattered, was an illusion. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? And yet, that's exactly the trap we're all caught in. You see, the world we live in is a master of deception, a carefully designed maze of distractions, glittering prizes, and endless noise. It whispers in your ear, "Look over here, this will make you happy. No, wait, this one's better." And just like that, we spend our days jumping from one craving to the next. We don't even realize it's happening. From the moment we open our eyes, we're bombarded. Notifications, headlines, advertisements, social media updates, endless conversations about things that don't matter. We've built an entire society around chasing what the Buddha called Maya, illusion. And like moths to a flame, we keep flying toward the light, never noticing it's the very thing burning us alive. Why do we do this? Because it's easier to scroll through someone else's carefully curated life than to sit with the discomfort of our own. Easier to chase the next achievement than to question why we feel so empty after the last one. Easier to drown in noise than to face the deafening silence of who we've become. The modern world is addicted to more likes, more followers, more money, more recognition. But no one stops to ask, at what cost? Every time we chase one of these distractions, we trade a piece of our soul. We give away our time, our attention, our peace. And the cruel irony is, the more we chase, the emptier we feel. You've felt it too, haven't you? That hollow ache after achieving something you thought would complete you. That quiet sadness when the applause fades. That restless hunger for something you can't quite name. This isn't a flaw in you. It's by design. The outer world was never meant to satisfy you. It was meant to distract you. Every billboard, every algorithm, every trend is engineered to keep you looking outward. Because the moment you look inward, the game is over. The ancient masters understood this long before our modern distractions existed. They saw how people wasted entire lifetimes chasing shadows. A man would devote his youth to gaining wealth, only to find that no amount of gold could buy peace. A woman would seek beauty, only to watch it slip through her fingers with time. Rulers would conquer nations and still lie awake at night, haunted by emptiness, because the problem was never the world. It was how they were looking at it. The Buddha called this dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of life. It's not that pleasure doesn't exist. It's that nothing external can ever fully quench the thirst inside you. Every joy fades. Every possession decays. Every title loses its meaning. And if you build your life chasing these things, you'll wake up one day, surrounded by everything and yet feel nothing. Look around you. How many people do you know who seem to have it all: money, fame, beauty, status, and yet they're miserable? Depressed, anxious, angry, numb. Why? Because the outer world is a mirage. It promises happiness, but it was never meant to deliver it. It offers pleasure, but not peace. It gives you attention, but not meaning. And so we jump from one thing to the next, like desperate travelers in a desert chasing mirages on the horizon. A new relationship, a new gadget, a new status symbol, a new validation. Always almost satisfied, but never quite there. And the deeper truth is, it's not because you're failing to find the right thing. It's because you're looking in the wrong direction. The world outside isn't your enemy, but it isn't your salvation either. It's like chasing the reflection of the moon in a puddle. No matter how desperately you grab for it, your hands will come up wet, but empty. The wise understood this centuries ago. They taught that the problem isn't in the objects of desire, wealth, success, even love, but in our attachment to them, in the belief that something out there can fill the hunger in here. And so we drown ourselves in noise. We turn up the volume of our lives, hoping we won't hear the quiet voice of truth calling us home. Because if we did, we might have to face the uncomfortable reality that no one and nothing is coming to save us. No new job, no perfect partner, no number in your bank account, no number of followers, because what you're looking for isn't out there. It never was. It lives in the one place you refuse to look within. And the world will fight to keep you distracted. It will throw shinier objects, louder opinions, newer fears. Because the moment you stop chasing, the moment you turn inward, the illusion shatters, and you realize you were always free, you just forgot. And in the chapters ahead, we'll explore exactly how this illusion works, why we fall for it, and most importantly, how to wake up from it. Because your life isn't meant to be a desperate chase. It's meant to be a quiet, steady return to yourself. And once you start walking that path, nothing outside you will ever own you again. There's a question that echoes quietly within every human heart. A question that surfaces in the stillness of sleepless nights, when the world's noise fades and you're left alone with your own mind. Why do I feel empty, even when everything seems fine? You might have the job, the relationship, the comforts, and the carefully crafted life others admire. And yet, there's a hollow space within you that no amount of success, affection, or distraction seems able to fill. What is this ache? Where does it come from? The Buddha called it dukkha, the subtle, persistent unease and dissatisfaction that underlies even our happiest moments. It's not always dramatic. Often it's quiet, like a restless pulse beneath the surface of your days. A feeling that something is missing, though you can't quite name it. And while the world will tell you to fix this emptiness by chasing pleasures, achievements, and external validation, the truth is far less convenient. Suffering does not begin in the outer world. It begins within you. Most people spend their entire lives fighting the wrong enemies. They blame others for their pain. They rearrange their circumstances, hoping a new relationship, a better job, a different city will finally make them whole. But wherever they go, they carry themselves with them, and the ache follows like a shadow. The one thing we refuse to confront is the very thing we can never escape: ourselves. Because within the quiet chambers of your own mind lies not only your joy, but also the roots of your suffering. And the longer you avoid facing yourself, the more tangled and persistent that suffering becomes. The ancient teachings describe 3 poisons at the root of human misery: desire, aversion, and ignorance. They are subtle forces that govern your thoughts, dictate your actions, and shape your entire experience of life. Desire pulls you outward, forever chasing pleasures, recognition, control. No matter how much you achieve, it's never enough. The moment one craving is satisfied, another arises in its place, leaving you restless and unsatisfied. Aversion, on the other hand, makes you resist what you cannot avoid. You run from discomfort, deny pain, reject change, and suppress the parts of yourself you find unworthy. But what you resist only grows stronger in the shadows. And ignorance keeps you trapped in illusions, believing that happiness lies in external things, clinging to a fragile sense of identity, and misunderstanding the true nature of reality. You see, it's not the events of your life that cause you to suffer. It's the stories you tell yourself about those events, the demands you place on life, the refusal to accept what is. The Buddha taught that suffering arises not because life is cruel, but because we insist it should be otherwise. We cling to the illusion of permanence in a world that is forever changing. We fight against loss, against aging, against uncertainty. We try to hold on to things that, by their very nature, are fleeting. But here's the truth the modern world won't tell you. No matter how far you run, no matter how skillfully you distract yourself, you will always come back to this, to your own mind. And until you learn to face yourself, to see clearly the mechanisms of your own suffering, nothing outside you will ever bring lasting peace. The longer you avoid the truth of your own heart, the more power your hidden fears and unexamined desires hold over you. What you bury festers. What you deny controls you in ways you do not see. Yet there is freedom waiting on the other side of this confrontation. Because when you stop running, when you sit quietly and look into the restless ache within you without judgment, something miraculous begins to happen. The grip of suffering loosens. The illusions start to dissolve. You realize that the flaws you feared would make you unlovable are part of the shared human experience. That your pain does not make you broken. That your darkness is not a curse but an invitation. An invitation to finally return to yourself. Beneath every craving, every fear, every restless impulse, there exists a still, unshaken core within you. A quiet awareness that has always been present, watching every joy, every heartbreak, every fleeting success and failure without clinging or rejecting. This awareness is untouched by the noise of the world, unmoved by pleasure or pain. And it is here, not in achievements, not in approval, not in escape, that peace lives. The only way to reach it is to turn inward, to stop chasing what cannot fulfill you, to stop running from what you cannot avoid, to sit, breathe, and witness yourself as you are, without embellishment or shame. It requires courage, because within you lie not only your noblest qualities, your compassion, wisdom, and tenderness, but also your jealousy, your anger, your regrets, and your unspoken fears. But what you are willing to face, you can transform, and what you refuse to see will quietly shape your fate. The great masters understood that suffering is not your enemy, it is your teacher. Every wound you carry holds a lesson. Every fear you avoid strengthens the chains that bind you. And every truth you deny blinds you to the freedom that has always been your birthright. When you finally face yourself, you realize there was never anything to fear. The monsters in the dark are nothing but shadows cast by your own mind. And in that moment, the ache quiets, the emptiness softens, the endless chasing loses its appeal, because you begin to remember who you really are beneath the masks, the cravings, the fear, a vast, silent witness to the ever-changing dance of life. This is where real peace begins, not in changing your life, but in changing your relationship to it. Not in silencing the storm, but in learning to be still within it. And it all starts when you stop running and turn to face yourself. Have you ever noticed how the world constantly pushes you outward? From the moment you wake, your senses are pulled in 1,000 directions. Notifications light up your phone. The demands of others call for your attention. Advertisements whisper promises of a better life if only you buy this, where that becomes someone else. Noise upon noise, layer upon layer, until you forget what your own thoughts sound like. Most people spend their entire lives in this external chase, running after things, running away from things, and never once pausing to ask, who is the one doing the running? The ancient masters spoke of a path not often traveled, a journey not through distant lands or exotic adventures, but a journey inward. And though it seems simple, this is the hardest journey of all, because turning inward means confronting the one thing you've spent years avoiding, yourself. What does it truly mean to turn inward? It isn't just about sitting cross-legged in a quiet room, eyes closed, pretending to be calm while your mind races in circles. It's not about rejecting the world or becoming indifferent to life's joys and sorrows. True inward turning is the art of seeing life as it really is, and more importantly, seeing yourself without illusion. It begins with awareness, noticing the way your mind moves, the thoughts that arise unbidden, the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve, watching how quickly you judge, cling, resist, or crave. It's the courage to witness your mind's chaos without immediately reaching for distraction or denial. And when you begin to notice, really notice, something extraordinary happens. A small space appears between you and your thoughts, between you and your emotions, between you and the restless habits that once controlled you without question. In that space, you meet yourself, not the mask you wear for others, not the polished image you've constructed for the world, but the raw, unfiltered being beneath it all. And what you find there might surprise you. Beneath the fear and longing, beneath the craving and avoidance, there is a quiet, steady awareness, a presence that has been with you since the first breath you drew and will remain after the final one leaves. Turning inward means making this awareness your home. It means letting go of the endless comparison, the need to constantly prove yourself, the belief that your worth is measured by how much you do, how much you own, or how others perceive you. It's realizing that no possession, no achievement, no relationship can fill the space inside you, because that space was never meant to be filled by the outer world. It exists so you can remember your own nature. But this journey is not easy. The moment you sit still, your mind will rebel. It will flood you with every unfinished task, every regret, every unspoken fear. It will convince you that you're wasting time, that you're foolish, that you should get up, check your phone, distract yourself. This is the mind's last defense against being seen for what it is, a restless, insatiable mechanism that feeds on endless doing. And so, the art of turning inward is, above all, an act of rebellion. In a world addicted to noise, choosing silence is radical. In a culture obsessed with images, choosing authenticity is rare. In a society that measures worth by productivity, choosing presence is revolutionary. The Buddha often spoke of this practice as a return, not to some idealized, perfect version of yourself, but to the simple, undistorted awareness that has always been there. The witness behind every thought, every pleasure, every sorrow. The one who observes without clinging or rejecting. When you turn inward, you do not abandon the world, you reclaim your place in it. No longer a slave to every impulse, no longer lost in every passing emotion. And as you begin to cultivate this inward gaze, something extraordinary begins to shift. The storms of the outer world lose their power over you. Praise and blame no longer determine your worth. Success and failure no longer define your identity. You begin to see the patterns of your own suffering, not with judgment but with clarity. And in that clarity, the roots of your restlessness begin to loosen. You discover that you don't need to run because there was nothing chasing you. That you don't need to chase because what you sought was never outside you. That peace isn't a destination at the end of achievement, but a quiet presence available in this very breath, if you're willing to turn toward it. Turning inward is not a single act, but a daily practice. It happens in small, ordinary moments, when you pause before reacting, when you notice your breath, when you catch yourself lost in thought and gently return. It's the decision to meet life as it is and yourself as you are, without the desperate need to fix, escape, or numb. This is not a path for those seeking comfort. It is a path for those seeking truth. And though it may lead you through the darkest corners of your own heart, it will also reveal a light untouched by darkness, a steady, unshaken clarity beneath the surface noise. And once you touch it, even for a moment, you will know what the ancient masters meant when they spoke of awakening. Because in the end, the true art of turning inward is nothing more and nothing less than remembering who you really are beneath the stories, beneath the masks, beneath the restless search. And it is here, within this silent remembering, that wisdom is born. In every tradition, in every age, there have been those who walked a little differently. While the world rushed toward desire, they moved toward silence. While others built empires of possessions, they built inner kingdoms. And while most sought to conquer the outer world, they chose instead to master the terrain within. These were the masters, but they were not born extraordinary. They were not granted wisdom from the heavens at birth. They were people like you and me, burdened with restlessness, caught in illusion, consumed by longing. What made them different was a single decision: to stop chasing shadows and turn toward the source of their suffering. Their stories aren't about miracles. They're about relentless honesty, fierce courage, and quiet, patient transformation. Take the story of Bodhidharma, the wandering sage who brought Zen to China. When he arrived at the Shaolin monastery, he found the monks weak in both body and spirit. Rather than give them lectures on philosophy, he taught them to sit in utter stillness, facing a cave wall for 9 years. Can you imagine? 9 years with nothing but your own mind for company. No distractions, no applause, no validation. Just the raw, unfiltered encounter with yourself. And in that long silence, Bodhidharma taught them the greatest lesson: that true power is born not from conquering others, but from mastering your own heart. Or the story of Milarepa, a Tibetan yogi who began his life soaked in hatred. Driven by revenge, he learned black magic and unleashed terrible destruction upon those who wronged him. But beneath the ashes of his violence, a spark of remorse remained. He sought a master and found Marpa, a teacher who didn't coddle him with kind words but shattered his pride through relentless hardship. Milarepa built towers of stone by hand, only to be told to tear them down and start again. Years passed in suffering, yet something within him softened. And through this breaking, wisdom bloomed. He later became one of Tibet's most revered saints, singing songs of emptiness and compassion. Then there's the story of Huineng, the illiterate woodcutter who became the 6th patriarch of Zen. While other scholars debated sutras and philosophy, Huineng grasped something deeper. When asked what the nature of enlightenment was, he replied, "There is originally no tree of enlightenment, nor a stand of a mirror bright. Since all is empty from the beginning, where can dust a light?" In one simple verse, he pierced through centuries of intellectual entanglement and pointed directly to the heart of being. And perhaps most humbling is the Buddha himself, not a god, not a distant legend, but a man who dared to question the very fabric of his life. Born into luxury, shielded from suffering, he had everything the world promised would bring happiness. Yet when he saw sickness, aging, and death, something inside him shattered. He realized no worldly pleasure could shield one from life's impermanence. And so he left it all: his palace, his titles, his family. For 6 long years he wandered, endured hunger, faced mockery, and wrestled with the shadows of his own mind. Until beneath a bodhi tree in the dead of night, he pierced through illusion and awakened to the profound truth of existence. What connects these masters is not perfection, but perseverance. They did not seek to escape suffering, but to understand it. They did not cling to borrowed beliefs, but tested wisdom against the fires of their own experience. And every single one of them began by turning inward. Their paths were not easy. The mind, after all, is a cunning adversary. It will resist, seduce, and terrify. It will whisper that you are wasting time, that you'll go mad, that peace is for saints and sages, not people like you. But the masters remind us, every storm eventually exhausts itself, and beyond it lies a sky that was never disturbed. And so, their stories are not ancient relics. They are mirrors. They ask us a question as old as time itself. When will you stop running? When will you finally turn and meet yourself? The way of the wise was never meant for a select few. It was meant for anyone with the courage to stop seeking outside and begin the descent into their own depths. It asks for no special talents, no lofty education, no perfection, only sincerity, and it begins exactly where you are, in the breath you're taking right now, in the moment you notice your mind drifting and gently return, in the decision to sit, to listen, to feel without judgment. The master's stories endure not because they promise escape, but because they reveal what has always been here, a quiet, unwavering presence beneath the noise of the world. A refuge not in heaven, not in possessions, but in the simple, steady awareness at the heart of your being. And so we remember their paths, not as distant myths, but as invitations. Because the same light that guided them still burns within you, all you must do is turn toward it. If turning inward was simple, everyone would be enlightened. The truth is, the moment you begin to look within, you will not first find peace. You will not be greeted by gentle wisdom or celestial calm. No. What you'll discover is a storm, a restless, tangled mass of thoughts, regrets, fears, and cravings. The mind is not a quiet sanctuary. It is a battlefield, and on this battlefield, your fiercest enemies are not others, not the people who wronged you, not the world's injustices, not even the relentless demands of modern life. Your greatest adversary is you. When you close your eyes and turn your gaze inward, you'll meet the shadows you've avoided your entire life. The ancient wounds, the buried grief, the unspoken shame. You'll hear voices telling you you're not enough. You'll feel old memories you swore you'd forgotten rise to the surface like ghosts long denied. This is what the old masters called maras, inner demons that block the path to awakening. In the story of the Buddha's final hours beneath the Bodhi tree, it wasn't hunger or thirst or wild animals that threatened him. It was Mara, the personification of fear, desire, doubt, and temptation. Mara whispered every insecurity. He conjured visions of terror. He offered power, pleasure, escape. But the Buddha did not fight him. He did not argue. He simply sat, steady as a mountain, and said, "I see you, Mara." That was enough. This ancient parable reveals a profound truth. What you refuse to face controls you. What you acknowledge loses its power. Yet most people never reach this point. The moment discomfort arises, they distract themselves. A phone screen, a new ambition, a relationship, food, noise, anything but silence. Anything but sitting still long enough to witness what truly lives inside them. The masters knew this. That's why their path wasn't built on comfort but on courageous honesty. They understood that your mind will resist. It will sabotage. It will project ancient pains onto new situations. It will dress old fears in new costumes. It will scream that you are broken, unworthy, incapable. But it's lying. Because beneath every inner demon is simply unprocessed pain, unloved parts of yourself begging to be seen. You cannot destroy these shadows. You can only illuminate them. When fear arises, you look at it. You name it. You feel it fully without letting it dictate your actions. When anger bubbles up, you witness it not as a fault but as a messenger. When loneliness clutches your heart, you welcome it like an old friend. And with each act of presence, each moment of clear seeing, these inner obstacles begin to dissolve. One by one. It's important to understand, this work is not glamorous. It won't impress anyone. There are no medals for sitting in the dark with your own suffering. No one will applaud when you choose silence over drama. When you face your shame, your rage, your emptiness, there will be no audience. But this is where real strength is forged. The old Zen saying goes, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The outer tasks remain the same, but the inner experience transforms. Because now, you are no longer driven by invisible fears, no longer reacting from old wounds. You carry the same burdens, but your heart is lighter. You realize that the obstacles within were never enemies. They were misunderstood guardians. Parts of yourself that, at some point, tried to protect you in clumsy ways. Anger shielded you from betrayal. Fear kept you from risk. Attachment softened loneliness. But what once served you becomes a prison if left unchecked. The wise learn to thank their demons, then release them. And this is the heart of turning inward. It is not a path of acquisition, but of subtraction. Not about becoming more, but shedding what you never truly were. The obstacles are not signs you're failing. They're signs you're finally reaching the heart of your suffering. And beyond them lies something ancient, unshaken, eternal, your true self. So when the shadows come, as they will, don't run. Don't fight, don't distract yourself. Sit, look them in the eye, say, I see you, Mara. And keep sitting. Because beyond the storm is the quiet you've sought your entire life. For most of your life, you've been taught that answers come from outside, from teachers, from books, from experts, from voices louder, older, and seemingly wiser than your own. But the ancient masters knew a secret the modern world has forgotten. True wisdom is not taught, it is remembered, and it lives in silence. When the noise of the world dies down, when the frantic chase for meaning, status, and approval pauses for even a moment, what rises to the surface is not emptiness, but clarity. In stillness, what was once hidden begins to reveal itself. The old Zen monks spent years in remote mountain monasteries, not because the mountains held magic, but because they understood a simple truth. The wisdom of the heart cannot be heard over the clamor of the world. It speaks in a language softer than thought, quieter than words. It arrives not when summoned, but when the mind becomes quiet enough to listen. This is why every tradition of inner practice, from the silent hermits of ancient India to the desert fathers of early Christianity, made stillness their teacher. When you sit in silence, something remarkable happens. At first, the mind rebels. It floods you with restless thoughts, old conversations, plans for the future, memories you hadn't touched in years. It tempts you with urges, check your phone, get up, distract yourself. It promises relief in movement, escape in noise. But if you stay, if you remain in that quiet long enough, a shift occurs. The thoughts begin to slow. The cravings lose their grip. The constant commentary in your head, like a radio left on too long, starts to fade into the background. And in that space, you begin to notice things you've missed your entire life. The subtle rhythm of your breath, the rise and fall of emotions as passing weather, the ancient ache in your chest you never tended to, the quiet hum of existence itself. And then slowly, you realize you've been carrying answers all along. In silence, your fears reveal their true size. In stillness, your doubts confess their origins. In quiet, the heart speaks, not in grand pronouncements, not in riddles, but in simple, undeniable knowing. A Zen story tells of a student who asked his master, "What is the path to wisdom?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat, when tired, sleep." The student, confused, pressed further. "But don't we already do that?" The master shook his head. "No. When you eat, your mind is elsewhere. When you sleep, you dream of tomorrow. The wise do each thing in full awareness without distraction." In this way, wisdom is not found, it is remembered. This is the power of silence. It teaches you to be here, fully, without past, without future. Because here, in this unadorned, unfiltered now, the truth is always waiting. But silence does more than reveal. It heals. In the quiet, the wounds you've buried begin to soften. The grief you avoided begins to find its voice. The judgments you carried against yourself dissolve, not because you reason them away, but because in the clear light of presence, they can no longer hold shape. Stillness is not emptiness. It is fullness without noise. It is not absence, but presence stripped of distraction, of craving, of resistance. And it doesn't require a monastery or a retreat. You can find it in a breath, in a pause between thoughts, in the moment before reacting, in watching a leaf fall without needing it to mean anything. Every day offers you 1,000 small invitations to silence. Most go unanswered. But if you begin to accept them, to linger a little longer in quiet, to listen a little deeper in stillness, you will begin to hear wisdom not found in books or lectures. You'll realize that the answers you sought in the world were always within you. Not because you lacked guidance, but because no voice is clearer than the one that speaks in the language of stillness. So when life grows loud, and it will return to silence, not as an escape, but as a homecoming, not to withdraw from life, but to finally meet it fully awake. In silence, you'll remember what the noise made you forget, that you were never lost, only distracted. The world you live in today is unlike any other in human history. Never before have so many voices competed for your attention. Never before have distractions been so constant, so intimate, so invasive. In your pocket, a device buzzes every few minutes, carrying messages, headlines, advertisements, each one designed to pull you away from yourself. You live in a digital age where silence feels unnatural, where stillness is mistaken for idleness, and where the value of a moment is measured by how quickly it can be shared, liked, and forgotten. And yet, despite the brilliance of modern life, the deepest ache of the human heart has not changed. You still long for meaning. You still hunger for peace. You still crave the quiet certainty that you belong to something greater than yourself. This is where the wisdom of the ancients becomes not a relic, but a lifeline. The masters of old walked mountain paths and sat beneath Buddhist trees not because their world was slower, but because they understood a truth the modern mind resists. The source of your peace will never be found in what you consume, but in what you release. Not in what you gather, but in what you let go. Today, turning inward is both harder and more necessary than ever. The path begins not by rejecting the modern world, but by learning to walk through it differently. A Zen proverb says, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The outer tasks remain, but the heart within them transforms. In your modern life, it means you can answer emails mindfully. You can sit in traffic, awake to your breath. You can scroll your phone, aware of the craving behind it. The practice is not to escape the world, but to meet it with presence. The ancients would rise with the sun, not out of ritual, but out of reverence for the natural cycles. You too can greet your mornings not by diving into noise, but by pausing, even for a minute, to feel the breath rise and fall. They would sit in stillness before meals, not out of habit, but to taste gratitude. You too can eat without a screen, without distraction, aware of each bite as a gift. The old masters spent years in silence not because words were forbidden, but because they knew wisdom lives between the words. You too can claim small moments of quiet, a walk without headphones, a pause before replying, a breath before sleep. In a world obsessed with doing, the most radical act is being. You don't need to leave your life behind. You don't need a monastery on a distant mountain. Your sacred space can be your bedroom, your desk, your commute, your kitchen sink. The ancient wisdom survives because it was never about the form, it was about attention. Where you place your awareness, there your life will unfold. The Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree for 7 days, facing his own demons, doubts, and illusions. You too sit beneath your Bodhi tree every time you choose awareness over reaction. Every time you resist the urge to escape into distraction. Every time you turn inward to listen before you speak. It's not the size of the moment that matters, it's the depth. A single mindful breath can change the course of a day. A single act of presence can soften a lifetime of hurry. The masters teach not that life will grow easier, but that you will grow clearer. The chaos of the world may never cease, but within you, a silence waits. Not an emptiness, but a still, clear pool reflecting the truth of what you are. In this moment now, you can turn inward. Close your eyes. Feel the breath as it moves. Notice the endless stream of thought, but cling to none. Return again and again to the quiet space within. Here, the wisdom of the ancients is not distant. It is alive in you, because the deepest truths were never meant for monasteries or temples alone. They were meant for kitchens, crowded streets, busy offices, and quiet bedrooms at midnight. The ancient path is walked in modern shoes, and every step inward is a return not to something new, but to something you've always carried. A knowing older than the world you live in. A wisdom no technology can replace. It waits in silence, it speaks in stillness, it moves in breath, and it calls you home. Wisdom is not born from books. It is not the result of age, nor the reward for a lifetime of collecting facts. True wisdom is the ability to see things as they are, without the distortion of your fears, your desires, or your stories. And this is no small task, because every human being carries lenses, invisible yet powerful, through which the world appears. You don't see reality, you see your version of it, filtered through the fog of memories, the weight of expectations, and the endless commentary of your restless mind. A person speaks to you harshly, and you think, they must hate me. But the truth might be that their own heart is burdened with sorrow. A challenge arrives and you think, why is this happening to me? But the truth is that life moves according to causes and conditions, indifferent to your preferences. You look in the mirror and you see flaws. You look at your past and you see regret. You look at the future and you see fear. But these are not truths, they are projections. Wisdom is born the moment you realize this. Not intellectually, not as a clever idea to debate, but as a lived, felt, undeniable experience. When the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree and touched the earth, he wasn't claiming territory. He was anchoring himself in reality. This is the ground, this is the body, this is the breath, this is the moment. No future, no past, no story, just this. And in seeing things as they are, the illusions began to fall away. Suffering, it turned out, was not created by life itself, but by the mind's refusal to accept it, by clinging to what must change, by resisting what already is. When you see a sunset without longing for it to last, you glimpse wisdom. When you feel pain without needing it to disappear, you glimpse wisdom. When you hear another's harsh words without making them about you, you glimpse wisdom. It is simple, almost too simple for the thinking mind to believe. The modern world teaches you to analyze, to judge, to improve. But the ancient masters knew that the deepest truths are revealed not through complication, but through clarity. A Zen monk was once asked, "What is the way?" He answered, "Everyday life is the way." But to walk that way requires eyes unclouded. It asks you to see your anger, not as righteous or shameful, but simply as a rising heat in the body, a tightening in the chest, a story in the mind. It asks you to see your joy, not as a prize to possess, but as a passing warmth, a ripple on the surface of awareness. To see death, not as a cruel end, but as a natural return. To see yourself, not as a fixed identity, but as a flowing river of sensations, thoughts, and experiences, endlessly arising and passing away. True wisdom is ruthless in its honesty. It does not flatter you. It does not soothe your ego. It will show you your attachments, your illusions, your borrowed beliefs, and it will ask you to let them go. Not because life is cruel, but because what you're clinging to was never real to begin with. In the deepest moments of stillness, you may sense it, that beneath the names, the labels, the roles you play, there is a quiet, wordless awareness watching it all. Not judging, not grasping, just seeing. This is the birthplace of wisdom. It's not found in temples alone. It's not hidden in ancient texts, though they can point the way. It's here, now, in this breath, in this moment, in the willingness to look clearly. When you begin to see things as they are, suffering no longer sticks. Joy no longer intoxicates. You move through the world like a calm river, carrying no burden, claiming no territory, resisting nothing. The world remains as it was, full of beauty, sorrow, noise, and change. But you begin to see the dance without getting lost in it. And in that clear seeing, peace is born. Not the fragile peace of favorable circumstances, but the unshakable peace of understanding. This is the wisdom the ancient ones spoke of, and it has always been waiting for you in plain sight. So here we are, at the end of this journey, or perhaps at its beginning, because every true path is a circle. The one who sets out seeking wisdom returns, not with new answers to boast of, but with quieter eyes, a softer heart, and a deeper humility before the mystery of life. You've traveled through illusions and distractions, faced your inner shadows, sat in stillness, and caught glimpses of a wisdom older than time itself. You've heard the echoes of ancient voices reminding you that the answers you seek have never lived in the world outside, that the greatest teacher is silence, that the deepest truths can't be spoken, only known. And now, standing at this threshold, you are invited to carry this light inward, not as a performance, not to impress, but because the world, though endlessly noisy, is starving for those who see clearly. The greatest offering you can make is not your cleverness, not your achievements, not your opinions. It is your stillness, your clarity, your freedom. When others are caught in the storm of appearances, you can be a steady shore. When others rage against the changing tides, you can be the deep ocean beneath. When others chase shadows, you can remain seated, eyes open to what is. Not because you are special, not because you are flawless, but because you remembered something they've momentarily forgotten. That peace is not a possession. It is your original nature, and wisdom is not a destination. It is the clear seeing of this very moment. The journey inward doesn't end here. It never does. As long as you have a body, distractions will come. As long as you have a mind, stories will arise. As long as you have breath, life will unfold in all its unpredictable beauty and sorrow. But now you know. Now you've seen. You've learned to recognize the games of the outer world. You've begun to face the ancient fears within. You've tasted the silence where wisdom waits. And though the path ahead is your own to walk, you do not walk it alone. Across centuries, sages and seekers have made this same turning inward. And in your quiet moments, you'll feel their presence. In the stillness between thoughts, in the gentleness of a single breath, in the space between sound and silence, they are there. And so are you, not as a name, not as a role, but as awareness itself. So take this moment, close your eyes, turn inward. Not to escape, but to return. Not to withdraw from life, but to meet it more fully. Carry this light with you. Not in your hands, but in your gaze. Not in your words, but in your presence. The world will go on spinning its stories. But you have remembered the still point at the center, and in that remembering you are free. This is not the end. This is your invitation. The journey continues within. Thank you for walking this path. Thank you for daring to turn inward. And until our paths cross again, may your steps be steady, your heart be clear, and your wisdom ever deepening. Stay silent. Stay awake. Stay free.